Hello, hello, dear friends, and welcome once again to the basement library with so many exciting things happen today. I have a wonderful announcement for you all, and before I say anything more, I'm just going to play you a little bit of music with me talking over it. Here we go. Whatever shadow may fall on your life, maybe you are worried about the fate of your country, or perhaps dark thoughts visit you concerning your own future. Or maybe your entire life seems an unbearable wound. Remember the fairy tale. Listen to her quiet, ancient, wise voice. From an essay on the spiritual meaning of fairy tales by Ivan Ilyin. Beyond the thrice nine lands, not that far from a certain kingdom, there was a certain land. A land where firebirds perch in golden apple trees, where wolves speak with the voices of sages, and the best that a prince can do sometimes is to sit on a log and weep. Welcome to In a Certain Land, a podcast where I tell Slavic fairy tales and epic poems. So pull up a chair or a log in the middle of the forest and let's listen together to the story's quiet, ancient, wise voice in our hearts. You never know what treasures you might find there. Yep. The new name of what was formerly In a Certain Kingdom is In a Certain Land. It's coming back. The fairy tale podcast is coming back, and hopefully better than ever. Of course, the question begs itself: what happened to In a Certain Kingdom, and why are we changing up the name and the music? Well, it's always, not always, but sometimes a good idea to freshen things up anyway. And let's be honest, I'll give you a bit of the backstory about how In a Certain Kingdom came about and why it was a good idea now to move away from the original version of it and to something slightly different. I actually had no memory of how the podcast started. Basically, in my mind, I have this vague memory of Natalie Wilson, the composer of the beautiful music, coming to me and showing me music for a Russian fairy tale podcast. And the music was so good, and she was so excited that in my mind, she became the creator of the idea. In fact, that was not the case. I went back and looked and found out that, um, in actual fact, it was my idea originally, but the idea came about at a very different time in a very different place. This different time and place is a world we know as pre COVID. In that world, I had just given a keynote at the Ancient Faith Writers and Podcasters blog, and it was a very vibrant time for me. I was in the middle of writing my Raven Sun series. I wasn't finished with it yet, and the excitement of being noticed and being supported by such a community as Ancient Faith was a high point in my creative life. And it was largely through the perspective of collaboration with them, the wonderful people over there, that the podcast idea even came to me. And as I was looking at some email exchanges between various people, it occurred to me that from the very beginning, what I was doing was continuing the thought process of something that was a part of Artifact Institute when it first started, and of my contributions to ancient faith in the pre-COVID time. This was very much about culture creation. It was very much about taking stories and applying them in almost didactic ways to help cultivate and create a common culture for this 21st century. Since then, a lot has changed. A lot. COVID came and revealed that the actual reality of what we live in is a lot different than what many of us thought. The divisions that are so profound right now and are getting worse every second of every day were not something that simply appeared as a result of COVID, but COVID revealed them. And as time went on, and as the idea of a common culture that everybody could get behind seems less and less possible, I started to consider, listen, and talk to people whose ideas were slightly different than what I had been encountering pre-COVID. These are people like Martin Shaw, like Paul Kingsnorth, like Jonathan Pajot, people who express an age-old wisdom that many of us had forgotten, and that is that in times of crisis, you have to go out into the desert. You have to go out to the margins. You have to go out far away from the center, from the city, from the kingdom, in order to, and by kingdom, I don't mean capital K, I just mean the center of a culture. You will have to go away from Camelot. You have to go into the deep green forest and look for the chapel where the Green Knight is in a time of cultural crisis. Something that was particularly beautifully made clear to me by Martin Shaw, one of the greatest storytellers of our time, and somebody with whom I've had some personal contact. And it became clear to me that what I had been doing within a certain kingdom was simply no longer appropriate for our time, no longer appropriate for the kind of person I became, no longer appropriate for the moment. And I thought of putting the stories away and simply doing something else. And yet, of all the things that I do, it's these stories that seem to resonate the most with the people that matter the most. And by that, I mean mothers of children. And yes, you do matter the most because you are cultivating the future of our world. And I know this so well, being a father and a husband to such a mother. And they kept asking, where is in a certain kingdom? Are the stories coming back? And I couldn't tell them that that they would. I couldn't tell them, yes, we're definitely doing this. And yet, with time passing, with conversations with Martin Shaw, Paul Kingsnorth, and working with Jonathan Pajot on his wonderful fairy tale Kickstarter, it's become clear to me that the stories are the heart of it all, in fact. And I never really knew that. When I was doing In a Certain Kingdom, the stories were a vehicle to an end that is no longer something that I am reaching for. I want to now turn back and return to the stories. If what I was doing in a Certain Kingdom was effectively transmitting a cultural moment of 19th century Russia, which is a worthy cause, I think, because it was a beautiful moment in the cultural history of Russia that we can all learn from, especially now. But these stories, they're not meant to be simply translated. They're meant to be retold. I don't have access to the bardic storytelling tradition of old Russia. Nobody does. The last living link to an oral storytelling tradition, it is said, died in the 1970s in the far north of Russia. There is no living link to the old tradition. It is gone. So what do we do? Do we just abandon it? No, because these stories, they don't die. We must find them again. I'm not saying that I'm going to start a new tradition of storytelling, but what I am saying is that I'm trying with great effort and hopefully humility to go back to the source, to inhabit those stories in a way that is less about translation and more about telling, to really be inside them, to have them speak in their own strange way through this vessel that is me. So that is In a Certain Land. We're going away from the kingdom. We're going beyond the reaches of the walls around the city. And we're going deep, deep into a wild and strange land where the stories are king. So practically speaking, In a Certain Land will be a fairy tale telling podcast. They will be just stories on the actual podcast. But that's not it, because the process of getting to the point of telling the story in a way that is okay for an audio setting with Natalie's beautiful music is actually more complicated than it was when I was doing it in a certain kingdom. In a certain kingdom, I'll let you behind the curtain a little bit. All it was me taking the old classics from the Russian published tradition, not the storytelling oral tradition, but the published tradition, and translating them into a more accessible version of English. That's the only difference, really, between any other translation of the famous Afanasiev collections of Russian fairy tales, or any other collections, most of which are from the 19th century. So now, this is going to be me finding a new way of telling these stories that is less about translation and more about the stories themselves. But that's hard, right? Because I'm experimenting at this. I'm new at this. This is something that I've never really been trained to do properly. Something that Martin Shaw, for example, has done his entire life. So, with his help and with a lot of study and with a lot of walking around in nature and with a lot of prayer, I'm experimenting with new storytelling voices. I'm letting the stories speak through me. Now, if that is interesting to you, if you're interested in seeing the laboratory sessions, the attempts to tell these stories without looking at a translation, you can. That's not what the In a Certain Land podcast will be. The In a Certain Land podcast is going to be more polished. But if you're interested in seeing what goes on behind the stage, in seeing the training, and seeing the laboratory, then come and join my Patreon community, which we now call the Waystone. That's where I'm going to be telling these stories live to a live audience on the internet. Unfortunately, not in person. That's not yet possible, though perhaps someday it will be. I've already started. I've recorded several live streams of me storytelling to my people. The first one was very rough, I will be honest, but they're getting better. And the thing that you will hear in the actual podcast will be hopefully as polished as I can get it, with some of the best music Natalie has ever written. And yes, this does mean that we're going to be going back through the archives of In a Certain Kingdom stories and rescoring them. There's going to be new music for all the stories. In other words, all the stories are going to be in this new place, which is focused primarily, its home base is my Patreon community. Because this spot, the Waystone, is the real heart of the matter. This is where all the exciting stuff happens. We have a book club. I tell live stories. We have get togethers where we talk about movies we've seen, books we've read. It's where I share, the only place I share experimental short fiction. It's a place where I give my wonderful patrons gifts every month. And that's where people find out about all the stuff I'm doing before anybody else does. And it's also where I'm going to do the thing that some of you really want me to do. I'm no longer including analysis sections as part of the podcast because honestly, it doesn't work. And I think I felt that throughout because it's always been very difficult for me to marry the story with the analysis. This is not something that should be done lightly because the stories by themselves are worthy. When we start analyzing them, we go into the dangerous place that so many storytelling specialists and folklorists do, which is basically cutting up the pieces of story and leaving nothing but a vivisected corpse. I don't want to do that. However, I've been reading some really fascinating research that brings to light what Ivan Ilyin has said in his wonderful essay on the spiritual meaning of stories, that shows, in fact, how these fairy tales are an incarnation, an instantiation of the people of Rus, that strange semi mythical place, passing from paganism to Christianity in a way that managed to actually respectfully look at the past while also moving boldly towards the future. Ilyin talks about this in a beautiful way in that essay. If you haven't read it, I have it on my website for free. Just look up the spiritual meaning of stories. So there are these books and these studies done by people who approach these stories with a lot of respect. And they go deep into the symbolism of the various images, the characters, the strange, bizarre things that happen. And don't explain them away, but open a small window into the past to show you how these stories have actually captured that movement away from paganism into Christianity. And in that way, show us as parents or as story lovers or as future, hopefully, storytellers, how such a process happened in history and how perhaps we might start employing that own process of taking massive cultural change and putting it into story. Maybe we can start doing that for our own culture. It's not something that's going to take 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It's probably going to take hundreds of years, but I'm okay with that. I'm willing to take my spot amongst the cathedral builders in medieval times who knew that it would be their grandchildren, if not their great grandchildren, that would see the finished work that their own rough hands began. That kind of interpretive work is going to be happening only in the Waystone in my Patreon community. So if that's something that you're interested in, come and join us there. Patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar. But the Fairy Tale Podcast, In a Certain Land, will be free. Will be available on all podcast players. It will be hosted on my Patreon, but those posts on Patreon will be public. Everybody will be able to have them, and you can access them through Spotify, through Google, through YouTube Music. Google Podcasts is going away, unfortunately. Any place you listen to podcasts, you will be able to find it. When? Okay, we're launching in the last week of October. I'm not giving you a specific date because I want you to perk your antenna up, perk your ears up, and just be aware. It's happening. The last week of October, it's happening. One of those days, be ready. It's going to happen. So I'll give you a bit of a preview of it at the beginning of that week. And at some point during that week, you'll get the first full episode of In a Certain Land. And I can't wait to share it with you. I'm so happy to do this again. I'm very excited. This is something simultaneously old and new, which is always what I've tried to do in my storytelling. And I'm so glad that so many of you have been so supportive and so encouraging in helping me get past the hump and really embracing this story as this storytelling podcast as a cornerstone of my offerings out there in internet land. Thanks so much, everybody. I can't wait to see you over in a certain land. See you soon.